Good morning, folks. I'm going to talk today a little bit about one or two of the features of the website. To start with, the section of the website in the main menus along the top that's called Odds and Ends. There are some commentaries there that are related to what it's useful to understand when studying psychopharmacology, but also some slightly more peripheral things and some slightly quirky and more personal things, which I hope some people will find interesting. So I'm going to start by talking about one or two of the bits and pieces in this odds and ends menu. There are several commentaries relating to sugar, alcohol, and the health effects of alcohol. There are several reasons for that, one of them being I'm interested in wine, another being that I nearly went into the wine trade rather than continue the practice of medicine, as there's a little bit about in one of those commentaries. You nearly lost me to the wine trade. And because they're all linked with evolution and with the very central key symptom of depression, which is anhedonia. And I found it interesting to research this, and I'll tell you a bit about it as an introduction to those three related commentaries. A famous evolutionary geneticist in the last century, a fellow with a Russian-Ukrainian name I can't really pronounce, but it was something like Dobzhansky. He emigrated to America and became a famous geneticist, evolutionary geneticist. He received a number of accolades in the academic sphere for his work. And he made the statement once that almost nothing in biology can be understood except through the lens of evolution. I think you can extend that statement to many things in medicine cannot be properly understood except through the lens of evolution. And I'd like to start off by illustrating what I believe is the correctness, the justification for that statement, by talking about alcohol and the various ways that satisfying our calorie intake has influenced what we are now and our relationship with alcohol. There are maybe many listeners who don't even believe in evolution, but certainly don't understand it. Many scientists who think they understand evolution, I don't think really do understand it. I claim some understanding of it. But one of the things that I think is interesting is how you can trace our relationship with alcohol back through evolution, right back to hundreds of millions of years ago when the insects were first evolving and flowering plants were evolving. Because very early on in the relationship between flowering plants and insects, they developed a close relationship, so that fruit flies lay their eggs preferentially on flowers whose nectar contains alcohol when they've got parasites in their intestines. And that's because, well, it isn't really because of course evolution doesn't have a rationale or a purpose or anything, it's just a random event. But the result of that is that alcohol helps to rid the Drosophila of the parasite, and therefore there's an evolutionary selection advantage in them laying their eggs in flowers with alcoholic nectar when they've got parasites. Now that of course fed back and meant that any of the flies that had a better ability to detect alcoholic nectar therefore had an advantage because they were more successful in laying their eggs in such flowers. And that meant that they had to have the sensory apparatus, the taste receptors and the smell receptors, that allowed them to detect alcohol and the sugars associated with them, etc. And that had to be wired up in their brain to drive that behaviour. And of course that's the origin of pleasure and directing you to foods that you enjoy, that you find pleasurable, and so on and so on. So way back then, hundreds of millions of years ago, there started to be a relationship between alcohol and the sensory apparatus and the reward mechanisms, even in fruit flies. And it's clear that that relationship was retained through the hundreds of millions of years of evolution. And then let's fast forward to our ancestors in the trees swinging around, and they were fruit eaters to a very substantial extent. So fruit was a very important source of their calories and thus important to their survival. So there became an advantage in being able to more easily detect ripe fruit as opposed to unripe fruit. There are all sorts of other aspects to this which we won't go into. There's something about it in the actual commentary that I've written for those that get round to reading it. But the long and the short of it is that we, Homo sapiens, are one of the only higher primates that has trichromatic vision. In other words, we can see red. Most of the monkeys have dichromatic vision, and that means they can't see the red colour of red fruit. And it seems clear that those monkeys that evolved the ability to, in whom trichromatic vision was selected, it was selected because they had an advantage, which was finding ripe fruit more easily in the forest and thus surviving better. So that when the genetic variation of trichromatic vision occurred, it was selected for. Then again, when our ancestors came out of the trees and started walking upright, a couple of different things happened. First of all, they encountered ripe fruit that had fallen to the forest floor and was therefore starting to ferment and becoming alcoholic. And secondly, walking upright created a problem with maintaining a higher blood pressure, because as soon as you stand upright, your heart needs to compensate for the effect of gravity. And as the brain got bigger and more active, it required more and more blood and more oxygen. Your brain, hopefully, consumes 30% of all the oxygen in your body, despite the fact your brain's only, whatever it is, 5% of your body weight. So, on a per weight basis, your brain consumes far more blood and oxygen than most other tissues. So when they started standing upright, they needed to maintain their blood pressure, to keep that blood flow to the brain, to keep it working and active. And because they had a low salt diet, low salt tends to lower your blood pressure, so that was a factor as well. So what seems to have happened at that stage is that the gene that selects for uric acid became redundant, because there was an advantage to not expressing it. So all the other apes don't have very high blood uric acid levels and have a gene that turns uric acid into another substance that they can excrete much more easily through their urine. Humans don't have that, so we get uric acid stones in our bladders, and our blood level of uric acid is much higher, which causes us to get gout. So why was it selected for? It was selected for because, very likely, it's not, nothing in science is proven, but there seems to be a lot of evidence that the selection pressure was because it increased blood pressure. Increased uric acid alters the balance of the renin-angiotensin system, which controls blood pressure. So it seems that losing the uricase gene and having a higher uric acid was a selection advantage because it allowed you to maintain your blood pressure when you stood upright. So here we have a whole lot of elements of evolution coming together and helping us to understand what happened when we came out of the trees, started walking upright, and then as evolution progressed, stopped being hunter-gatherers and around the Neolithic, about 10,000–12,000 years ago, started building permanent settlements and having a fixed agricultural way of life. Back to the alcohol thing. So first of all, the apes that came out of the trees and started standing upright encountered more alcoholic fruit on the forest floor. And contrary to what some people seem to think, there's no doubt whatsoever, it's been measured and demonstrated clearly now, that fruit like that and other sweet substances in nature spontaneously ferment, because of course all of these fruits are covered in natural wild yeasts that are capable of fermenting sugars into alcohol. And the concentration of alcohol in such fruits on the forest floor can be the same as the strength of standard beer nowadays, and even stronger. So in other words, 4 or 5%, and even sometimes as strong as 8% or more. So there's no doubt that occurs, and there's no doubt that it affects animals. Somebody's demonstrated that bats that feed on alcoholic nectar or whatever get drunk and can't fly as well. I thought that was quite funny. Anyhow, so that meant that the apes on the forest floor were more likely to get intoxicated. And of course the apes in the trees and the other great apes have a form of the alcohol dehydrogenase gene, enzyme, that's 40 times less efficient than the one we have as Homo sapiens. And that evolved around the time. So the selection pressure for developing that variant of the gene that's much more effective at metabolizing alcohol occurred around the time we started walking upright when we came out of the trees 4 to 5 million years ago. And then in human settlement, when permanent settlement started, people started cultivating cereals and fermenting them, either naturally or artificially, and so on and so on. And even the genetics of yeast demonstrates that it looks like humans selectively selected them on purpose to be better for producing a kind of fermented porridge brew. So there I think you have, there are more details in the relevant commentaries, but the point of that is to illustrate that there's a very complex evolutionary relationship between foods, fruits driving colour vision and fermenting sugars in fruits and flowers, producing alcohol, and that affecting the way animals behave. So that even from primitive man we consumed alcohol, and alcohol, because of evolution, had a built-in ability to drive our pleasure centres, and that explains why consuming alcohol releases dopamine and gives you a positive feedback response, a pleasure response. One of the other commentaries about alcohol describes a bit more about all those relationships, and the third one describes a little bit more about the true health effects of consuming alcohol. And of course, like all foods, whether it's sugar or anything else, a certain amount is good for you, and excessive amounts clog up the system and cause all sorts of problems. So whether it's sugars contributing to obesity or alcohol contributing to other health difficulties, that helps to balance an understanding of how those things occur and why they occur. So that third article is a more objective analysis of how alcohol affects your health. And also it contains, I hope, some helpful and relevant information on what the various different relative levels of risk are with different behaviours and activities and, food consumption. Because of course it's no good worrying about having too much alcohol if you've then got a 10 or 100 times higher chance of being run over by a motor car. And I'm not being frivolous when I say that. The relative risk of dying of cirrhosis of the liver is a couple of orders of magnitude lower than your lifetime risk of being killed, dead, in a car accident. Never mind your risk of being seriously injured in a car accident. The overall risk in most Western societies for death in a motor vehicle accident is about a 1% lifetime risk. So if you cut down the amount you drove in your car by 1/3, you would reduce your risk of dying prematurely. And of course, many car accidents cause people to die in their 20s and 30s, not in their 70s and 80s. So the total loss of lifetime, so to speak, is much, much greater. And that's vastly higher than the risk of dying from most of the things that alcohol contributes to. So, for instance, there's absolutely no doubt that alcohol is a carcinogen and that it increases your risk of various forms of cancer. But the relative increase in risk is not that great, and compared to things like car accidents or firearm accidents or whatever, is very, very considerably lower. And so it's important to understand those sorts of considerations when balancing the risk. And one of the other points that was made, there was a very good book published after a conference in London only a couple of years ago about the role of alcohol in human evolution. And of course, historians and people who study the history of sociology, social culture and social evolution will point out that almost all human societies, alcohol has played a very intricate role in social interaction and oiling the wheels of society. And that can't be dismissed or trivialized. So I think that all of that is very interesting as an interface, if you like, between pure science and psychology and society and all those kinds of things, which of course is in many ways what a lot of psychiatric treatment and medicine has to do with, because there's a close interrelationship between genetics and the environment and so on and so on. So that's one special facet of all of that, and I think a very, very interesting one. So there you are. That's an introduction to a set of commentaries that are in that odds and ends menu.